March 15, 1945. Juniper Falls Elementary, New Mexico. Hazel Caulfield opened the attendance ledger and felt her stomach tighten. 7 empty desks stared back at her from the third and fourth rows. 7 children absent from a class of 22, all marked sick. This wasn't the first time in the past 6 months. Hazel ran her finger backward through the pages. February 9th, 6 absent. January 24th, 8. December 17th of last year, 9. She pulled out her personal notebook from the locked drawer of her desk, the one she kept hidden beneath old geography textbooks, and cross-referenced the dates. They matched perfectly. The children weren't getting sick by chance. They were getting sick on a schedule. A schedule created by someone else. Someone who lived beyond the barbed wire fences of the military installation 40 miles northwest of town, past the desert scrub and the warning signs that read, U.S. government property, no trespassing, use of deadly force authorized. Someone who looked up at the pre-dawn sky each morning and counted down seconds until a flash of light that no civilian was supposed to witness. But the children had witnessed it. Their bodies had witnessed it. And now they were paying a price that the adults in town had agreed never to discuss. Hazel didn't yet know that within 3 months, half these children would be dead. She didn't know that authorities would try to erase her from the town's memory like chalk marks wiped from a blackboard. She didn't know her hidden notebook would become the only evidence of a crime that would never be officially investigated. But in that March morning, staring at 7 empty desks, she felt fear for the first time. Not for herself, for the children who would return tomorrow, pale and hollow-eyed, with dark circles and hair left behind on their pillows. Hazel Caulfield was 33 years old, and she had been teaching geography for 12 years. She remembered Pearl Harbor, remembered the rationing, remembered how the war had transformed her quiet New Mexico town into something else entirely. She thought nothing could frighten her after December 7th, 1941. She was wrong. It had started a year ago, in the fall of 1944. A new student, Marshall Tibbs, had been brought to her classroom in September. A thin boy with large, dark eyes and a mouth that rarely smiled. His father worked at the installation. That's all anyone said, just quote one. And his mother was a nurse at County General Hospital. The family lived in one of the new government-built houses on the north side of town, where they housed military personnel and scientists. Marshall sat at the back desk by the window and barely spoke to his classmates. He was bright, attentive, always prepared for lessons. But 3 times in October 1944, he was absent. His mother sent notes. __quote _2___. In November, he missed 5 more days. In December, a full week. Hazel only noticed the pattern when she realized Marshall wasn't alone. Vera Lockwood, daughter of an engineer, started missing school frequently. Then Dolores Patterson, Warren Moss, Curtis Sherwood. All of them children of people who worked at the installation or in the restricted research buildings near the railroad depot. All of them absent on the same days. At first, Hazel assumed it was an epidemic, some childhood illness spreading through the class. But epidemics weren't this precise. Epidemics didn't select only specific children. Epidemics didn't start and stop like clockwork. In January 1945, Hazel began keeping her secret journal, an ordinary composition notebook where she recorded each child's absence dates. Initially, just curiosity, a teacher's instinct to identify patterns, pedagogical thoroughness, nothing more. But the more she recorded, the clearer the pattern became. Children fell ill in clusters, always after weekends or holidays, always suddenly. And they always recovered after 3 or 4 days, returning to class pale, gaunt, with a peculiar adult fear in their eyes that children shouldn't possess. Hazel wasn't naive. She knew that 40 miles northwest, beyond the desert, something important and classified was happening. She knew civilians weren't allowed near it, that scientists and military personnel worked there, that sometimes loud booms echoed across the valley that officials called training exercises. Everyone knew, but nobody spoke about it. That was the wartime way. Pearl Harbor had taught people not to ask unnecessary questions. Loose lips sink ships. But Hazel was a teacher. Her job was to ask questions, and she asked the crucial one. Why did children get sick on the exact days when especially loud booms came from the installation? The connection revealed itself by accident. In February 1945, during a faculty meeting, Principal Marjorie Kellerman complained about noise. Yesterday there was such a tremendous boom that the windows rattled. How are we supposed to teach with that racket? Hazel checked her notebook. Yesterday was February 10th. The next day, February 11th, 6 children were absent. She went home and reviewed all her records. Every time there was a boom loud enough to rattle windows, children started missing school the next day. Not all at once, but in waves. First children living closest to the installation, then those in the center of town, then others, as if something invisible was spreading from an epicenter, covering the town in rings, like ripples in water from a dropped stone. Except this wasn't water, and the stone wasn't ordinary. Hazel understood fully when she saw Marshall after one of his absences in late February 1945. The boy returned to class looking transformed. He was so pale his skin looked translucent. Dark circles had settled under his eyes like bruises, but the most frightening part was his hair. When Marshall removed his cap in the coat room, Hazel saw patches of scalp showing through. Small bald spots, but noticeable. His hair was falling out in clumps. She had seen this only once before. In 1943, when a Red Cross convoy had passed through their town carrying wounded soldiers from the Pacific Theater. Some of them, she later learned from whispers, had been near Japanese cities after the atomic bombs. Not during the blasts, but after. They had gone in to help, to search for survivors, and they developed strange symptoms. Hair loss, bleeding gums, a slow, terrible death from something invisible called radiation sickness. Marshall's mother had written that he had the flu, but the flu didn't make hair fall out. The flu didn't leave children looking like concentration camp survivors. Hazel made a decision that morning in late February 1945. She would document everything. Not just attendance, symptoms, patterns, timelines. If children came back with nosebleeds, she noted it. If they looked thinner than before, she measured it against her memory. If they mentioned headaches or nausea, she wrote it down. The notebook became more than a record. It became evidence. Evidence of what, she wasn't entirely certain. But her gut told her something terrible was happening to these children, and somebody needed to witness it. The booms continued through early March 1945, each one followed by a wave of absences. Hazel noticed another pattern. The absences were getting worse. More children, longer durations, sicker when they returned. Warren Moss came back in mid-March, barely able to walk. His parents had to carry him into the building. The school nurse, Gladys Fenton, took one look at him and called his mother to take him home. "He needs to see a doctor," Gladys said firmly. "He needs a hospital." "The doctors have seen him," Warren's mother replied, her voice strained and defensive. Gladys didn't argue, but later, in the teacher's lounge, she confided to Hazel. Hazel asked, though she already suspected. Gladys lowered her voice, glancing nervously at the closed door. Hazel's blood ran cold. "You think—" "I don't think anything," Gladys interrupted quickly. Too quickly. "I'm just saying those symptoms look familiar. But that would be impossible. This is New Mexico, not Japan. And the government wouldn't test weapons near civilians. Would they?" She trailed off. Both women sat in silence, the weight of unspoken suspicion hanging between them like smoke. That evening, Hazel walked through town to the public library. She wanted information. The library's newspaper archive section held copies of the Alamogordo News and the Albuquerque Journal. She started searching for articles about the installation. There was nothing substantial. A few mentions of __, quote _15____. A note about military personnel being stationed in the area, but no details. Nothing about what kind of research. Nothing about testing. She tried a different approach. She looked up articles about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Scientific American had published a technical piece about radiation effects. She read it 3 times, taking careful notes on a scrap of paper. The symptoms matched perfectly. Hair loss, bleeding, weakness, nausea, immune system collapse, radiation poisoning, acute radiation syndrome. The librarian, elderly Mrs. Delvecchio, appeared beside her table. Hazel looked up, startled. Mrs. Delvecchio's expression was unreadable. "Be careful what you research, Mrs. Caulfield. These are sensitive times. The FBI has been visiting libraries recently, checking borrowing records, making sure nobody's reading the wrong things." "The wrong things?" Hazel asked carefully. "Communist literature, Japanese sympathizer materials, anything that questions the war effort or government activities." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They came here last week. Asked about you, actually." Hazel's heart began to pound. Quote 22, quote 23. She glanced around the empty library. Quote 24, quote. Hazel gathered her notes with trembling hands. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 25, underscore, underscore. Walking home through the dark streets, Hazel felt eyes on her everywhere. Every car that passed seemed to slow down. Every shadow seemed to conceal a watcher. She was being paranoid, she told herself. This was Juniper Falls, New Mexico, a town where everyone knew everyone, a town where she had lived for 8 years, where she taught children, where she was respected and trusted. But something had changed. The war had changed it. The installation had changed it. And now, asking questions was dangerous. That night, she hid her notebook in a new place. Not in her desk anymore, too obvious. She unscrewed the return air vent in her bedroom closet and slid the notebook behind it, into the space between the wall studs. Then she carefully replaced the vent cover. If someone searched her house, they might not think to look there. The next morning, March 16, 1945, 2 of the absent children returned. Marshall Tibbs and Dolores Patterson. Both looked worse than before. Marshall's bald patches had spread across his scalp like a disease. Dolores had purple bruises up and down her arms that looked like they had appeared from nothing, spontaneous bleeding under the skin. During geography class, while discussing the climate zones of South America, Dolores raised her hand weakly. "Mrs. Caulfield, I don't feel good." Before Hazel could respond, Dolores vomited onto her desk. Not the normal sick child vomit, but dark and bloody, streaked with red. Hazel rushed her to the nurse's office immediately. Gladys Fenton took one look and reached for the telephone to call for an ambulance. Dolores's mother arrived before the ambulance, white-faced and shaking. "Not here," she hissed at Gladys. "We'll take her ourselves." "Mrs. Patterson, this child needs a hospital emergency room." "We'll take her to our doctors, the ones who've been treating her." "What doctors? What treatment?" "That's not your concern." The mother gathered her daughter in her arms and left quickly. No ambulance came. Gladys and Hazel stood in the empty nurse's office, both thinking the same thing. Those weren't regular doctors. Those were government doctors. Military doctors. Doctors who worked at the installation and knew exactly what was wrong with these children. That afternoon, Hazel was called to Principal Kellerman's office. Sitting in the chairs across from Kellerman's desk were 2 men in dark suits and fedoras. FBI, Hazel knew immediately. They had that unmistakable look, crew cuts, stone faces, unsmiling eyes that evaluated everything. "Mrs. Caulfield," Principal Kellerman began, her voice tight with nervousness. "These gentlemen are from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They'd like to ask you some questions." "Questions about what?" Hazel kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "About your extracurricular activities," one of the men said. His name tag read, Special Agent Harrison. "We understand you've been asking questions. Questions about things that don't concern you." "I'm a teacher. I ask questions. It's my profession." "Questions about government facilities, about classified operations, about matters of national security. I've asked no such questions. You were at the library yesterday evening, the other agent, Carmichael, said flatly, reading articles about atomic radiation, taking notes. Why? I was preparing a lesson about the atomic bomb. We're studying current events, the war. The war in Europe ended in May, Harrison corrected coldly. The war in the Pacific continues, and your sudden interest in radiation effects seems peculiar. Unless you have a specific reason to be concerned about radiation exposure in this area. Hazel's mouth went dry. They knew. They knew exactly what she suspected. But they were testing her, seeing if she would say it out loud. Give them evidence they could use against her. She chose her words very carefully. Quote 47. Quote 48. The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above her head. Hazel felt sweat on her back despite the cool office. They knew about the notebook. Someone had told them. Who? The principal? Another teacher? One of the parents? A student? Hazel said. Carmichael said. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. Hazel's heart hammered, but she kept her face neutral. Do you have a warrant? We don't need a warrant. This is a matter of national security. Under the Espionage Act and wartime executive orders, we have broad authority to investigate potential threats to the United States. Am I a threat to the United States? Hazel asked. That depends on what you've been doing, what you know, what you've recorded. Principal Kellerman spoke up, her voice apologetic and pleading. Mrs. Caulfield, please, just cooperate with them. Tell them what they want to know, and this can all be resolved quickly. I have nothing to tell them, Hazel said, meeting Kellerman's eyes. Quote 64, quote. The agents exchanged meaningful glances. Harrison stood slowly. Quote 65, quote 66. The words escaped before she could stop them. The room went silent. Harrison smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator. You're mistaken, Mrs. Caulfield. The children are being cared for by the finest doctors available. Doctors with expertise in specific areas. But these matters are classified. Teachers don't need to know medical details. Teachers need to teach, nothing more. And if the children keep getting sicker, then their doctors will handle it, not you. You don't have the clearance, the expertise, or the authority. Harrison moved toward the door, then paused deliberately. Mrs. Caulfield, I'm going to give you some advice. Free advice. Stop asking questions. Stop taking notes. Stop making connections that don't exist. Focus on your job. Teach geography. Grade papers. Go home to your husband. Live your life. Because if you don't, he let the threat hang unfinished in the air. If I don't, what? Hazel asked, her voice shaking but defiant. Then we'll have to conclude that you're not fit to teach children, that you're a security risk. And security risks lose their jobs, their homes, their freedoms. Sometimes they disappear entirely. Do we understand each other? Hazel understood perfectly. She nodded slowly. The agents left. Principal Kellerman remained seated, looking suddenly old and tired. Hazel, please, let this go. How can I let it go? Children are dying. You don't know that for certain. I do know that. So do you. We all know it. We're just too scared to say it out loud. Yes, Kellerman admitted quietly, her voice breaking. We are scared, and we have good reason to be. Do you know what happened to Peter Gruber? Hazel shook her head. He was a chemist, worked at the installation. Last year, he started asking questions about safety protocols, about whether the workers were being adequately protected from exposure. 3 weeks later, he disappeared. His wife received a telegram saying he'd been transferred to Washington, D.C. for consultation with the War Department. She never saw him again, never heard from him again. The official story is that he defected to the Russians, sold secrets. His wife doesn't believe that. I don't believe that. But what can we do? We're ordinary people in an extraordinary time. The government is fighting a war. They're developing weapons that could end the war quickly, save hundreds of thousands of American lives. And if that requires some sacrifices, who are we to question it? Sacrifices, Hazel repeated bitterly. That's what you call dead children? Sacrifices? Keep your voice down, Kellerman hissed, glancing at the door. Hazel, I'm not heartless. I see what you see. I know those children are sick. I know something is wrong. But I also see the bigger picture. If we lose this war, if Japan invades the mainland, millions will die. Millions of American civilians. Against that possibility, a few sick children in one small town. They're not just statistics. They're Warren and Marshall and Dolores and… I know their names, Kellerman's voice cracked. Hazel stood. Hazel left the office before Kellerman could respond. She taught her remaining classes in a daze, going through the motions mechanically. That evening, she didn't go straight home. She went to the post office and rented a post office box under a false name, Emma Whitmore, listing her address as a farm outside town that she knew was abandoned. Then she went home and made copies of her notebook pages, carefully transcribing every detail into a second notebook. One copy would stay hidden in her wall. The other copy would be mailed to the post office box, sealed in a package addressed to holder of box 247. If they searched her house and found one notebook, they might not find the other. If both were discovered, at least she would have tried. The rest of March 1945 was a living nightmare. More children got sick. Not just her class anymore. Other classes too, other grades. The pattern was spreading through the school like an invisible plague. And as it spread, the official explanation kept changing. First, it was flu. Then measles. Then a new strain of polio that doctors were studying. Each explanation contradicted the last, but nobody questioned it publicly. Parents accepted whatever the government doctors told them. They had no choice. Their jobs depended on cooperation. Their housing depended on cooperation. Their entire lives existed at the pleasure of the installation and the military machine. To question was to risk everything. On March 29, 1945, Warren Moss died. The official cause of death listed on the certificate, pneumonia with complications. But Hazel had seen him 2 days before his death when his parents brought him to school to collect his belongings. She had seen the bruises covering his body, the bleeding gums, the way his skin seemed to be falling apart from the inside. That wasn't pneumonia. That was radiation sickness, acute and fatal. The funeral was small and quiet, held on April 2, 1945. Warren's parents stood stone-faced beside the small casket while the preacher recited generic condolences about God's mysterious plan. Nobody mentioned that Warren had been perfectly healthy 6 months ago. Nobody mentioned that 8 other children in town were exhibiting the same symptoms. Nobody said the truth out loud, that something was killing the children, and everyone knew it, and everyone was pretending not to know because speaking the truth meant losing everything. Hazel attended the funeral. She stood in the back of the church, watching. She saw the other parents there, the parents of the sick children. They all wore the same expression. Fear mixed with resignation, mixed with a desperate, futile hope that their children would be spared whatever had taken Warren. After the service, Hazel approached Warren's mother, Judith Moss. "Mrs. Moss, I'm so deeply sorry for your loss. Warren was a wonderful student. Please don't." Judith's voice was flat and dead. Quote 95, quote 96, quote 97, quote 98, quote 99. Judith's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained hard. "You made it worse. The FBI came to our house, interrogated my husband for 3 hours, threatened his job, told us that if we talked to anyone about Warren's real illness, if we mentioned anything about the installation or made any accusations, we'd be considered security risks, that we'd lose everything, our home, our income, our future. So we stayed quiet. We agreed to call it pneumonia. And Warren died anyway. And you know what? I'm glad we stayed quiet, because at least we still have a home. We still have income. We can bury our son with dignity and move on with our lives. But if we'd talked, if we'd made noise the way you wanted us to, we'd have nothing. Warren would still be dead, and we'd be destitute, homeless, blacklisted. So thank you for your concern, Mrs. Caulfield, but please stay away from my family. She turned and walked away, leaving Hazel standing alone in the church parking lot. That night, Hazel cried for the first time since it all began. Not just for Warren, but for the impossible position they were all trapped in. She had thought documenting the truth was heroic, but maybe it was selfish. Maybe it was making things worse for families who just wanted to survive this nightmare. Maybe the only real kindness was silence. But then she thought about the children yet unborn, the future generations who would live near installations like this one, who would breathe air contaminated by tests, who would suffer and die without anyone speaking for them. And she realized, silence might be kind in the short term, but truth was kind in the long term. Even if it cost her everything, even if it cost these families everything, the truth had to be recorded. For the future, for justice, for the chance that someday, somehow, it might prevent this from happening again. April 1945 brought more deaths. Dolores Patterson succumbed on April 14th to what doctors called acute leukemia. Except leukemia doesn't develop in just a few weeks. Curtis Sherwood died on April 23rd of __102__. Except healthy 12-year-olds don't die of heart failure. Vera Lockwood hung on, barely, her parents taking her to specialists in Albuquerque who were completely baffled by her rapidly deteriorating condition. By mid-April, 4 children from Hazel's class were dead. 6 others were critically ill. The remaining students came to school in a fog of fear and confusion, waiting to see who would be next. The booms from the installation continued, louder now, more frequent, as if whatever was being tested had reached a critical phase, an intensification. Each boom was followed by the now familiar pattern: absences the next day, sickness, sometimes death within weeks. Hazel continued documenting despite the danger. She recorded every detail, no matter how small. She noted wind direction on the days of the booms, wondering if that affected which neighborhoods got hit hardest. She noted the distance of each child's home from the installation. She created crude maps, charts, timelines. Her hidden notebooks grew thicker, more detailed, more damning. And then, on April 22, 1945, she received a visitor at school. Not FBI this time, but a man in a military uniform, an Army colonel, his insignia indicated. He introduced himself as Colonel Thaddeus Brennan, commander of the installation. He requested to speak with her privately. They went to an empty classroom. The colonel closed the door firmly and stood with his back to it, physically blocking her exit. "Mrs. Caulfield, we have a serious problem." "What problem, Colonel?" "You're creating difficulties for a vital national defense program. Your questions and your observations are causing alarm among military families. Morale is suffering. Efficiency is being impacted. That's unacceptable during wartime." "Children are dying, Colonel. That's what's unacceptable." "Children die every day, Mrs. Caulfield, from disease, accidents, countless natural causes. It's tragic, but it's life. It's reality. Not like this. Not in these numbers. Not with these specific symptoms." "And what symptoms are those?" His voice was cold as ice. "Be specific. Describe them for me." Hazel knew it was a trap. If she said radiation sickness, she would be admitting she understood what was happening at the installation. That would confirm she possessed classified knowledge. That would make her an official security threat. I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose. But I can count. And the numbers are alarming. The numbers, the colonel repeated slowly. Tell me, Mrs. Caulfield, do you have documented numbers? Records? Charts? Evidence of any kind? I have attendance logs, official school records. I've reviewed those. They show nothing unusual. Normal childhood illness rates for a town this size. But I'm asking about other records, personal records, private documentation. Because if such records existed, they would be a very serious problem. They could contain classified information. They could compromise national security. They could fall into enemy hands, Japanese spies, Soviet agents. Do you understand? I have no such records. Are you absolutely certain? I'm certain. The colonel studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. He placed it on the desk between them deliberately. Hazel's blood froze. It was her husband, Fletcher, standing outside his hardware store on Main Street. The photo had been taken recently. She recognized the spring window display they'd just set up. Your husband owns Caulfield Hardware, correct? The colonel asked. You know he does. Good business. Supplies a lot of the construction crews in the area, including government contractors who work on installation projects. Quite profitable, I understand. It would be unfortunate if that business relationship were to end. If suddenly all those lucrative contracts dried up. If supply chains were disrupted. If building inspectors found violations. Building code issues, fire hazards, improper inventory management. Small businesses are fragile, Mrs. Caulfield. One bad month can destroy them completely. Hazel felt rage building in her chest, hot and sharp like a blade. You're threatening my husband. I'm explaining reality. Your husband's prosperity depends entirely on maintaining good relationships with the right people. Your family's security depends on your cooperation with national defense efforts. And if I don't cooperate? Then your husband loses his contracts immediately. His business fails within months. You lose your teaching position. I've already discussed that possibility with Principal Kellerman. You'll be blacklisted from teaching anywhere in New Mexico, possibly anywhere in the country. Your name will appear on certain lists, lists that banks see when you apply for loans, lists that landlords see when you apply to rent, lists that make life very, very difficult for people who are considered security risks. You can't do that. This is America. We have constitutional rights. Rights exist during peacetime. Mrs. Caulfield, we're at war. Wartime rules are different. The government has broad powers to protect national security. The Supreme Court has upheld this repeatedly. If we determine that you're a threat, even a potential threat, we can act, swiftly and decisively, and there's no appeal, no recourse. I'm not a threat. I'm a teacher concerned about dying children. Then act like a teacher. Teach geography, nothing more. Forget about patterns you think you see. Forget about boom noises and sick children. Forget about everything except multiplication tables and state capitals. Can you do that? Hazel wanted to say no, wanted to spit in his face, tell him she would never stop seeking truth. But she thought about Fletcher, about their modest but comfortable life they'd built together, about the mortgage on their house, the savings account they'd carefully accumulated, the future they'd planned. All of it could be destroyed with a few phone calls from this man. She thought about Warren's mother, standing in the church parking lot, explaining bitterly why silence had been the only option for survival. Maybe Judith was right. Maybe survival required surrender. I can do that, Hazel whispered. Good. The colonel picked up the photograph and returned it to his jacket. I'm glad we understand each other. You're a smart woman, Mrs. Caulfield. Smart enough to know when to stop digging. The children who are sick are receiving excellent medical care from top doctors. Their conditions are unfortunate but unrelated to any government activities. That's the official position. And it's the truth. Anyone who suggests otherwise is spreading dangerous misinformation that aids our enemies. Am I absolutely clear? Crystal clear, sir. Excellent. Then we won't need to have this conversation again. He left. Hazel sat in the empty classroom for an hour afterwards, staring at nothing. She had been defeated. Not by violence or arrest, but by the simple economics of survival. They didn't need to imprison her. They just needed to threaten everything she and Fletcher had built together. That evening, she told Fletcher everything. He listened without interrupting, his face growing graver by the minute. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, thinking. Quote 136 quote, he finally asked. Hazel considered this. Fletcher paused. Hazel felt a surge of love for this practical, careful man who was offering to make himself complicit in her dangerous truth-telling. Underscore underscore quote underscore 146 underscore 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 quote underscore 147 underscore underscore. So, they made a plan. Hazel would transcribe her notes into a third copy, a complete, comprehensive record. Fletcher would seal that copy in waterproof packaging and hide it in the false bottom of a storage crate in his warehouse, beneath legitimate inventory. If anything happened to Hazel, if she were arrested or silenced or disappeared, Fletcher would know where the evidence was. And someday, when it was safe, he could reveal it. Over the next 2 weeks, Hazel worked late into the nights, copying every detail from her notebooks. Her hand cramped from hours of writing, but she persisted. Every date, every symptom, every observation, every boom she'd heard. She created a comprehensive record of what had happened in Juniper Falls between September 1944 and May 1945. A record of children sickened and killed by something the government refused to acknowledge. By May 10, 1945, the transcription was complete. She gave it to Fletcher, who sealed it carefully in multiple layers of waxed paper and canvas, and took it to his warehouse. He returned late that night with a small key. This is the key to Storage Unit 7. The crate is marked Hardware Supplies Aberdeen Contract, but there's no Aberdeen account. It's a fake label. If something happens to me, if I disappear or die unexpectedly, you'll know where to look. Hazel took the key and hid it inside her wedding ring box, beneath the velvet lining where her rings rested. That night, they made love for the first time in months, both of them acutely aware that they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They were now conspirators against the government, traitors in the eyes of the FBI and the military, but witnesses in the eyes of history. On May 12, 1945, another boom echoed across the valley. This one was different, sharper, brighter, more powerful than any before. Hazel was in her backyard hanging laundry on the clothesline when she heard it. She looked northwest toward the installation and saw something she'd never seen before, a flash on the horizon. Brief but intensely bright, like lightning without clouds, like the sun had exploded for just a second. Then the boom, rattling her windows, shaking the ground beneath her feet. She felt something strange on her skin, a warmth, almost like sunlight, but wrong somehow. Prickling, tingling, wrong. She hurried inside immediately and scrubbed her hands and face and arms, seized by irrational panic. That evening, Marshall Tibbs didn't come home from school. His parents found him collapsed in an alley 3 blocks from his house. He was unconscious, bleeding from his nose and ears, convulsing. They rushed him to County General Hospital, where military doctors immediately took over, pushing the regular staff aside. Marshall never regained consciousness. He died 4 hours later, at 9:47 p.m. on May 12, 1945. The official cause of death, brain aneurysm. He was 12 years old. By the end of May 1945, 7 children from Hazel's class were dead. 3 more were hospitalized in critical condition. The remaining students came to school like ghosts, pale and silent, afraid to speak, afraid to hope they might survive. Parents stopped making eye contact with Hazel in the hallways. She had become associated with death, with dangerous questions nobody wanted to answer. In June 1945, the school year ended. Hazel wasn't invited back for the fall term. Principal Kellerman apologized, claimed budget cuts and enrollment decline, but they both knew the truth. Hazel had been fired for knowing too much and refusing to stay silent. Fletcher's hardware store lost all its military contracts 2 weeks later in mid-June. No explanation given. Orders simply stopped coming. By July, they were struggling financially. By August, they were deeply in debt, unable to pay suppliers. By September 1945, they were packing up to leave New Mexico. They couldn't survive in Juniper Falls anymore. The installation had destroyed them without ever officially acknowledging their existence. Before they left town, Hazel visited the cemetery one final time. 11 small graves now, in a section reserved for children. 11 white headstones in neat rows. She stood among them, reading names she had once written in her attendance book with hope that they would graduate, grow up, have futures. Warren Moss, 1933 to 1945. Dolores Patterson, 1933 to 1945. Curtis Sherwood, 1932 to 1945. Marshall Tibbs, 1933 to 1945. Vera Lockwood, 1934 to 1945. And 6 others from different classes, different grades, all dead within 8 months, all between the ages of 9 and 14. She placed wildflowers on each grave, desert blooms that would wilt in a day, but it was all she could afford now. As she stood there in the September heat, an old woman approached slowly. Hazel didn't recognize her. One of the townsfolk, perhaps an elderly grandmother, come to tend a grave. "You're the teacher," the woman said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "I was," Hazel replied. "Thank you for trying." "I didn't save them." "No, but you saw them. You remembered. You bore witness. That matters more than you know." The woman continued past, leaving Hazel alone with the dead children and the crushing weight of failure. Fletcher and Hazel Caulfield moved to Oregon in October 1945, to her sister Margaret's property outside Portland. Fletcher found work in a lumber mill, hard physical labor, much less money than his hardware business had generated. Hazel eventually got a teaching job at a rural school in 1946, using her maiden name, Hazel Pritchard. They never spoke about Juniper Falls. They never spoke about the notebooks hidden in the storage crate back in New Mexico. They tried desperately to build a normal life, to forget, to move on. And for a while, they succeeded. They had 2 children, daughters, born in 1948 and 1950. Fletcher's wages were modest but steady. Hazel taught geography to children who stayed healthy, who didn't mysteriously fall ill after boom noises from classified installations. Life moved forward. The war ended. Prosperity returned. America rebuilt. But Hazel never forgot. On March 15th of every year, the day she'd first truly understood what was happening, she lit a candle in her kitchen and said the names of the children who had died. Warren, Dolores, Curtis, Marshall, Vera, and the others whose names she'd memorized. She said their names aloud so that someone, somewhere, would hear them, so that they wouldn't be completely forgotten by the universe. In 1949, newspapers reported that the United States had successfully conducted atomic weapons tests at a new site in Nevada. The articles were brief and factual, celebrating American military superiority. No mention of civilian populations nearby. No mention of health effects. No mention of the earlier test sites that had come before Nevada. The ones in New Mexico that nobody talked about publicly. Hazel read those articles and felt a bitter vindication. She had been right all along. The booms, the illnesses, the deaths, they had been atomic testing. The government had tested nuclear weapons near populated civilian areas, and children had died from radiation exposure. She had known it all along, but now it was essentially confirmed by the mere existence of the Nevada program. But confirmation didn't help the dead children. It didn't help the parents who had buried them. It didn't even help Hazel, because she couldn't do anything with the knowledge. She was 1,000 miles away, using a fake name, hiding from her own past, trying to protect her family from retribution. Years passed. The 1950s became the 1960s. The Cold War intensified. More atomic tests in Nevada, hundreds of them, all of them publicized now. The government was confident enough to admit what it was doing, testing weapons to protect America from communism. Downwinders became a recognized term. People who lived downwind of test sites and developed cancers, thyroid problems, birth defects at alarming rates. Lawsuits were filed. Some succeeded, most failed. The government admitted to some harm but consistently downplayed the extent. Hazel watched it all from her distant Oregon home, feeling helpless. She thought constantly about her notebooks, hidden in Fletcher's warehouse in New Mexico. Were they still there? Had the building been sold, the contents discarded as junk? Or had the FBI found them, destroyed them? She didn't know, and she was too afraid to find out. In 1967, Fletcher died of lung cancer at age 59. He had never smoked a day in his life, but the cancer was aggressive and unstoppable. Hazel wondered if it was related to their time in Juniper Falls, if he had been exposed to something during those terrible months of booms and sickness and fear. But she would never know for certain. After Fletcher's death, Hazel became obsessed with the storage crate. She needed to know if it still existed, if the evidence had survived. So, in 1968, at the age of 56, she made a trip back to New Mexico, her first time returning in 23 years. Juniper Falls had changed dramatically. The town was bigger now, more prosperous. New houses, new businesses, shopping centers. The installation was still there beyond the desert, still classified, but now officially acknowledged. It had a formal name, White Sands Missile Range. The war was long over, but the weapons development continued unabated. Hazel went to where Fletcher's hardware store had been on Main Street. It was now a modern appliance shop, completely renovated with plate glass windows. She asked the young owner if he knew what had happened to the previous business's inventory when it changed hands. He didn't. The building had changed ownership several times over the decades. Everything from the old store was long gone, sold off or thrown away. But Hazel remembered. The storage unit hadn't been at the store. It had been at a separate warehouse facility on the edge of town, near the railroad tracks. She drove there, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The warehouse was still standing, older and more decrepit, but functional. She parked outside and sat in her car for 20 minutes, gathering courage. Finally, she went inside. The manager was a young man in his 20s, far too young to remember the 1940s. Hazel explained that her late husband had rented a storage unit there many years ago. Did they still have records? Could she possibly access it? The manager checked dusty old ledgers in a back office. Storage Unit 7 had been rented by Fletcher Caulfield from 1945 to 1952. When rent payments stopped, Fletcher had simply forgotten about it after they moved to Oregon. The unit was declared abandoned. The contents were emptied and sold at public auction in 1953. Hazel asked, heart sinking. __quote _156 __. The evidence was gone. 20 years of sitting safely in storage, surviving, waiting to be found. And then sold to some dealer who probably threw away the fake-bottomed crate as worthless junk, never knowing what it contained. Never knowing he held proof of government crimes. Hazel thanked the manager numbly and left. She sat in her car outside the warehouse and wept. All that effort, all that risk, all that careful documentation, for nothing. The evidence was destroyed, the children forgotten, the crime unrecorded. She had failed completely and utterly. But she hadn't failed. Not completely. In 1975, a graduate student at the University of New Mexico named Patricia Stedman was researching the history of atomic testing for her doctoral dissertation. She was particularly interested in civilian impacts, downwinder communities, the human stories that didn't make it into official military histories. She visited small towns throughout New Mexico, interviewing elderly residents, collecting fading memories. In Juniper Falls, she spoke with retired school teacher Lydia Brenner, who had worked at the elementary school in the 1940s. Patricia asked, tape recorder running. Lydia hesitated, uncomfortable. Then, quote, 158, quote, 159, quote, 160, quote, 161, quote, 162. Patricia noted this carefully. After the interview, she went to the county records office and requested death certificates from 1945. She found them. 11 children, all deaths clustered between March and June of that year. Causes listed as pneumonia, leukemia, heart failure, brain aneurysm, a variety of different diagnoses. She compared this to death rates from previous years and subsequent years. 1943, 2 child deaths. 1944, 3 child deaths. 1945, 11 child deaths. 1946, 4 child deaths. 1947, 2 child deaths. The spike in 1945 was obvious and dramatic. Something had happened that year, something that killed children. Patricia spent months tracking down Hazel Caulfield. She checked teaching records, union registrations, Social Security databases. Eventually, she found her in Oregon, Hazel Pritchard, now 63 years old, living alone in a small house in a Portland suburb, teaching part-time at a community college. Patricia knocked on her door one rainy autumn afternoon in October 1976. Hazel answered, confused by the strange young woman on her porch with a notebook and an eager expression. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 163, underscore, underscore. Hazel's face went white. Her hand gripped the doorframe. I don't know what you're talking about. Please, Mrs. Caulfield, I'm not FBI. I'm not military. I'm not a government agent. I'm just a graduate student trying to understand what really happened, to document the truth. People I interviewed mentioned you. They said you asked questions, that you tried to help the children. Those records are gone, destroyed, lost. Hazel's voice was barely a whisper. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 167, underscore, underscore. Hazel looked at this earnest young woman with her notebook and her determination and her belief that truth mattered, and something broke inside her. She had been silent for 31 years. 31 years of carrying this knowledge alone, letting it eat at her soul. And now someone was asking. Someone cared. Someone believed her. Hazel said quietly. They talked for 6 hours. Hazel told Patricia everything. The patterns she'd noticed, the symptoms, the booms from the installation, the FBI visits, the colonel's threats, Fletcher's plan to hide the evidence. The fact that the evidence had been lost to a warehouse auction. Patricia recorded it all on a cassette tape recorder, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Then she asked the crucial question. Do you remember any specific details from your notebooks? Dates, names, symptoms, anything at all? I remember everything, Hazel said, her voice strong for the first time. I've relived it every single day for 30 years. Every detail is burned into my memory like a brand. I couldn't forget if I tried. Can you write it down? Even without the original documents, your testimony is valuable. It's evidence. It's a witness account. So Hazel began to write. Patricia visited every week, bringing supplies, legal pads, pens, folders, encouragement. Hazel reconstructed her notebooks from memory. It took 6 months of painstaking work. Her recall was imperfect after 3 decades. Some dates were approximate, some details fuzzy. But the major facts were there, etched in her mind. Dates of booms, names of children, symptoms observed, patterns noticed, the timeline of deaths. She wrote everything she could remember, hundreds of pages of testimony. Patricia incorporated Hazel's testimony into her dissertation. She also filed Freedom of Information Act requests for documents about testing at the Juniper Falls area installation during 1944 to 1945. Most requests were denied outright, national security. But some heavily redacted documents trickled through. Pages with most text blacked out, but containing tantalizing clues. References to, quote, 173 mentions of, quote, 174 budget line items for, quote, 175. In 1977, Patricia's dissertation was completed and defended. Silent casualties. Civilian radiation exposure from classified nuclear weapons testing in New Mexico, 1944 to 1946. It was the first academic work to comprehensively document the Juniper Falls incidents. It cited Hazel's detailed testimony, the death certificates, the FOIA documents, and statistical analysis showing the mortality spike. It concluded that classified nuclear weapons testing had occurred near Juniper Falls during 1944 to 1945, that at least 11 children had died from acute radiation sickness, and that the government had systematically covered up the deaths to protect the weapons program. The dissertation was immediately controversial. Some scholars praised it as groundbreaking, courageous research. Others dismissed it as conspiracy theory, lacking sufficient hard physical evidence. But it got attention. Newspapers picked up the story. Quote 177 __. The articles were somewhat sensationalized, but they brought visibility to the issue. In 1978, Congress held hearings on radiation exposure from atomic testing, prompted by growing pressure from downwinder communities. Patricia was invited to testify as an expert witness. So was Hazel. Hazel, now 66 years old, traveled to Washington, D.C. for the first time in her life. She sat at a table before a panel of senators and representatives in a formal hearing room, with cameras recording her every word for the official record. She told her story calmly and clearly. The children, the symptoms, the patterns, the booms, the cover-up, the threats. Some senators were sympathetic, asking gentle follow-up questions. Others were openly skeptical. One senator, a conservative from Texas with military connections, accused her of fabricating the entire story to malign the defense establishment. Quote, 178, quote, he said dismissively. Hazel replied, her voice steady and clear. Her voice broke slightly on the last words. Several people in the hearing room were visibly moved. Her testimony was emotional, powerful, deeply credible. It didn't lead to immediate legislative action. The government was still resistant to acknowledging wrongdoing. But it planted seeds. More researchers began investigating civilian impacts of atomic testing. More downwinder communities came forward with their stories of cancers, birth defects, mysterious deaths. The Juniper Falls case became part of a larger pattern of government negligence and secrecy. In 1980, Hazel received an unexpected phone call from a stranger. A man named Gerald Pritchard, no relation, who identified himself as an antiques dealer in Albuquerque. Mrs. Caulfield, I think I have something that belongs to you. Hazel's heart began to pound so hard she could barely breathe. Hazel couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face. Mrs. Caulfield, are you there? Yes, she whispered. I'm here. Gerald continued. I saw your testimony on C-SPAN last year. The congressional hearing. Recognized the name immediately. Figured these notebooks must be yours. I've been holding on to them, trying to decide what to do. I could sell them to collectors. There are people who pay serious money for historical documents like this. But that seemed wrong. These are evidence of something important. So I'm offering them back to you. No charge. They're yours. They survived, Hazel whispered in awe. All those years, 27 years in your warehouse, forgotten. But they survived. Gerald mailed the notebooks via registered mail, insured for a significant amount. When they arrived at Hazel's Oregon home, she opened the package with trembling hands. There they were, 3 composition books, yellowed and musty but completely intact. Her handwriting from 1945, recording the deaths of children in careful detail. Proof. Evidence. Vindication. She called Patricia immediately. Patricia drove up from California, where she was now teaching, and examined the notebooks carefully. They were authentic, paper chemically dated to the 1940s, ink analysis consistent with that era, details that perfectly matched death certificates and other historical records Patricia had uncovered. Patricia wrote a follow-up article for the Journal of American History, this time with physical documentary evidence to support all the claims. The article was peer-reviewed, published, and widely circulated in academic circles. It couldn't be dismissed as false memory or conspiracy theory anymore. The notebooks existed. The children had died. The government had covered it up. The evidence was irrefutable. In 1983, after years of pressure, a congressional investigation concluded that classified atomic weapons testing had indeed occurred at several sites in New Mexico between 1943 and 1946, including in the vicinity of Juniper Falls. The investigation confirmed that safety protocols were woefully inadequate, that civilian populations were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, and that health impacts had been systematically concealed from the public and from the victims themselves. Hazel was invited to a formal government apology ceremony in Washington, D.C. in May 1983. She attended, now 71 years old, walking with a cane, her hair completely white. A mid-level government official read a carefully prepared statement expressing regret for the suffering caused to downwinder communities and acknowledging the government's failures to adequately protect civilian populations. It was very carefully worded, admitting some wrongdoing without opening the door to massive lawsuits. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded Hazel, asking how she felt. Quote, 191, quote, she said honestly, quote, 192, quote. In 1986, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, providing financial compensation to individuals who develop specific cancers after exposure to fallout from atomic testing. Families of children who died in Juniper Falls in 1945 were eligible to apply under the provisions. Most of the parents were dead by then, but some surviving relatives, now middle-aged adults, received payments. It was relatively small compensation, $50,000 per documented victim, but it was official government acknowledgement of harm done. Hazel lived to see it all. She lived to see her story validated completely, her notebooks enshrined in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., her name cited in history textbooks and academic papers. She gave lectures at universities across the country, spoke at memorial services for downwinder communities, became a recognized voice and advocate for victims of government nuclear testing. She was celebrated as a whistleblower, a truth-teller, a brave woman who had stood up to government power when it would have been far easier and safer to stay silent. But privately, in her quiet moments alone, she still felt like a failure. She had documented the deaths, but she hadn't prevented them. She had borne witness, but she hadn't saved the children. That guilt never fully left her, even with all the vindication and recognition. In 1994, at age 82, Hazel agreed to participate in a final interview for a PBS documentary about the history of atomic testing in America. The filmmaker asked her the same question everyone always asked. Hazel thought for a long moment, gathering her thoughts carefully. Then, Hazel Caulfield died peacefully in her sleep on January 8, 1998, at age 86. Her obituary ran in newspapers across the country, calling her quote, _199 and quote, _200 _. Her funeral was attended by downwinder activists, historians, former students from Oregon, and several now elderly people who had been children in Juniper Falls in 1945, the ones who had survived. Patricia Stedman, now a renowned professor of history, gave the eulogy. Quote, _201 The PBS documentary aired in 1999, a year after Hazel's death. It reached millions of viewers across America. The story of Juniper Falls became widely known, taught in high school history classes, referenced in college textbooks about the Cold War era. Hazel's original notebooks were put on permanent display at the Smithsonian Institution as part of a major exhibition on Cold War America and its hidden costs. In 2005, the town of Juniper Falls, which had officially changed its name to Juniper Springs in the 1980s to distance itself from the dark past, erected a memorial in the renovated town square. A bronze statue of a woman in 1940s dress holding an open notebook, looking down with a sorrowful but determined expression at 7 empty chairs arranged in a semicircle around her. Each chair bore an engraved nameplate: Warren Moss, Dolores Patterson, Curtis Sherwood, Marshall Tibbs, Vera Lockwood, Nathaniel Hughes, Constance Eller. The inscription on the base read, __quote_202__. On the memorial's dedication day in March 2005, one of Hazel's daughters, Eleanor, now 55 years old, spoke to the assembled crowd of several hundred people. __quote_203__. The crowd applauded. Eleanor stood by the bronze statue of her mother, tears streaming down her face, and thought about the quiet woman who had taught geography, but who had really been teaching something far more important: that truth matters, that justice matters, that every voice matters, even the smallest and most frightened. The sun set over Juniper Springs that evening, casting long golden shadows across the memorial plaza. The 7 empty chairs sat in silent testimony. And in the Smithsonian, thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., Hazel's notebooks lay preserved forever under protective glass, pages yellowed but words still perfectly clear and legible. March 15, 1945. 7 absent. Warren Moss, Dolores Patterson, Curtis Sherwood, Marshall Tibbs, Vera Lockwood, Nathaniel Hughes, Constance Eller. Causes: fever, weakness, nausea, bleeding. Pattern continues after booms. Truth must be recorded. For the children, for the future, for justice. The notebooks would remain there forever, bearing witness across generations, a testament to one small woman's attempt to stand against a vast machinery of power and secrecy. An attempt that seemed completely futile at the time, but that, in the end, genuinely changed history. Because truth has weight, memory has power, and one voice, speaking bravely in darkness, can light a flame that burns for generations. Hazel Caulfield had been that voice. Quiet, frightened, but ultimately unbreakable. A voice of conscience in a world where conscience was considered weakness. And the children of Juniper Falls, Warren and Dolores and Curtis and Marshall and Vera and Nathaniel and Constance and all the others, would never be forgotten now. Their names were carved in bronze. Their story was told in classrooms. Their deaths had achieved meaning. Not the meaning anyone wanted. They should have lived full lives, should have grown up, married, had children of their own, grown old. But meaning nonetheless. They became symbols, warnings, reminders that governments can lie, that power corrupts absolutely, that ordinary citizens must remain vigilant, and that when ordinary people do remain vigilant, when they document injustice and testify truthfully and refuse to be silenced by threats, they can move mountains. It takes time, decades, sometimes entire generations. Justice delayed is not justice denied, only justice postponed. But it comes eventually. It comes. That was Hazel's final gift to the children she couldn't save in life. The absolute certainty that their deaths would be publicly acknowledged, their suffering officially recorded, their memory permanently preserved. In a world that tried desperately to erase them, she made them permanent. And that, perhaps, was heroism enough.